We're focusing on that breaking news from Russia that the US envoy Steve WITkoff is now holding talks with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. Now, these images have been released within the last hour. President Trump previously said that Russia has until Friday to agree a ceasefire with Ukraine or face tough sanctions. Well, following talks with the US president on Tuesday, President Zelensky of Ukraine welcomed the threat of tougher US sanctions on Moscow. But after a deadly strike on Zaporizhia overnight, he is urging the US to ramp up pressure on the Kremlin. He said it's very important to strengthen all the levers in the arsenal of the United States, Europe and the G7 so that a ceasefire truly comes into effect immediately.
Дуже важливо, що в Москві почали.
It is very important that Moscow has begun to heed the pressure from the world, from the United States of America, from the threat of tougher sanctions for the war. Indeed, one of the key sanctions tracks is against Russian oil. For Russia to agree to peace, it must run out of money for the war. We are working towards this, and I am grateful to everyone in the world who supports us.
Volodymyr Zelensky there. Well, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg says today's meeting comes ahead of a deadline which was imposed by Donald Trump, a deadline that ultimately may end up being meaningless.
Mr. Trump himself has doubted publicly whether further sanctions will actually put enough pressure on Vladimir Putin to change his approach to the war in Ukraine. But still, on paper, that is what's going to happen. 2 days from now, the Trump deadline expires and we can expect more sanctions against Russia.
So in theory, that's what's meant to happen. Arguably, the things can change, as is the way with President Trump. But one thing is evident. He is feeling frustrated, increasingly so, with his Russian counterpart.
Absolutely. And he's expressed that frustration, that irritation publicly. We've seen lots of statements to the press where he's talked about Russia's disgraceful actions. He's talked about being disappointed with Vladimir Putin. He's used strong language at times when referring to the Russian president. Very different kind of language from the language he was using back in February and March and April, when it seemed as if the US-Russian relationship was making great progress. President Putin and President Trump both said they wanted to rebuild relations between Moscow and Washington. They had several telephone conversations, but Donald Trump has said that every time it seemed as if a deal was close between Russia and the United States on Ukraine, that deal never happened. And that has translated itself into President Trump's frustration, and it means we are where we are now, with Washington apparently moving from carrots to sticks and this deadline and the threat of additional sanctions. But as I say, whether the United States goes through with this threat of additional sanctions, we'll have to wait and see.
Our Russia editor there, Steve Rosenberg. Well, let's pick up on some of those points from Steve with our next guest, Professor Paul Moorcroft, a former Ministry of Defence analyst, and so you're also the author of Putin's Wars, NATO's Flaws. So just picking up on some of those points made by Steve, are we seeing now the US, President Trump especially, finally feeling annoyed with President Putin, and we're going to see more carrot than stick, and in which case sanctions arguably haven't worked as well as they could have? Are we looking at more serious options?
It's a dangerous time when I'm worrying about people sleepwalking into war, because Trump is an old man in a hurry. And he wants to get all things sorted, particularly nothing's much happening in Gaza. Steve WITkoff is a very busy man. He's made it possibly worse in Israel because there's now international pressure for a two-state solution, which Trump doesn't want. And at the same time, he's now trying very hard to help a ceasefire emerge in Ukraine. Now, nobody likes ultimatums, particularly the Russians. And Trump is not a man with a sense of history, because this week is the 80th anniversary of, as we know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And how did that all start? What led to Pearl Harbor? It was American sanctions. Part of the reason was American sanctions on the Japanese empire. And nobody wanted war, particularly the Americans, but it happened. So that this, in the last couple of weeks, Trump is moving submarines around, which is complete nonsense. Because, as I said previously on the BBC, you can fire them from the Thames or outside Washington if you have to. It has just raised the tensions in what is now effectively a hybrid Third World War. It's very, very dangerous. Now, if WITkoff, I was trying to find out how good his Russian is. His grandparents were Russian-speaking, Jewish immigrants. And he sometimes doesn't always use an interpreter. But I don't know how good his communication skills are, because Trump can bully the EU about tariffs, but you can't bully people with nuclear weapons. And that is the stage. It is very dangerous now. And will it happen? Sanctions happen on Friday? I doubt it, because it's just as difficult to organize sanctions, secondary sanctions, particularly on India, as it is to evade them. And the Russians have these big shadow fleets, which everybody's talking about. And I don't see any of the Western navies sinking them.
It's interesting that you pick up on the point of the translator, because WITkoff has been criticised for using Kremlin-supplied translators. Arguably, there's a suggestion that there's a lack of understanding how to go about these kind of geopolitical discussions, diplomacy, and that is possibly a flaw when it comes to the approach that the Trump administration is taking in all of this.
Apparently, WITkoff had some Russian when he was young from his maternal grandparents. But he's no Kissinger. Even if he were, he's just come back from Gaza. It's endless negotiations. And he's not a superhuman. Maybe he's good at the cliche real estate deals. But to try and persuade Putin, who feels he's winning, he thinks that the Ukrainians are about to collapse. And Trump is in a rush. He wants to clearly pull out of Europe. He wants to resolve, in his terms, end the Ukraine war in order to pull out of Europe. He wants to pull American troops out by the midterm elections next year so that he can focus on the real threat, which is Taiwan. Now, WITkoff, even if he were Kissinger, as I said, would be very unlikely to persuade Putin. Presumably he's going to meet him. But Putin is a man who can't show weakness. And nobody likes ultimatums, particularly the Russians. This is not going to work. I would love there to be a ceasefire. I've spent time in Ukraine, admired the army there, but it isn't going to happen. I wish it would happen, but I wish Trump would stop saber rattling, moving submarines around, which is symbolic nonsense. It's just saying, look, I'm threatening you. And he's now threatening Putin again, not just with submarines, but with sanctions. Putin's not going to respond to this very well.
What a note to leave it on. Professor Moorcroft, author of Putin's Wars, NATO's Flaws, thank you very much for joining us.